We are a proud member of Health by Design and have had the honor of working with many of the people and organizations in this room to truly, I think, jumpstart the transformation of many Indiana communities. So that's been a real honor for us. Our next speaker has a true track record of transforming communities in very tangible ways, with a particular emphasis on increasing walking options. Tom Samuels is originally from Toronto, Canada, where he created and launched North America's first Safe Routes to School walking school bus program through the City of Toronto and Health Canada. Tom relocated to Chicago to develop the city's Safe Routes to Schools walking school bus program for over 450,000 public school children at 600 schools. He's also served as lead designer and project manager for numerous public infrastructure projects which focused on sustainable land use and transportation options. Tom is a co-founder of America Walks, the Partnership for a Walkable America, and National Walk to School Day. He has a bachelor's in accounting, a master's in landscape architecture, and a certificate in leadership through Northwestern University. We're very happy to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Tom Samuels.
So, first of all, 1997, C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General, he announced that all Americans should do physical activity for 20 minutes a day. That was 1997. That changed everything. Before then, I started Safe Routes to School in 1993 and 94, walking school bus in 1994 with my friend David Enwich. These were nice ideas. In Canada, they took off. In the States, they were at best marginal. When Koop made that announcement, everything changed, and it was taken seriously. So a huge shout out to the public health professionals and that community, because the landscape architects, the planners, the bicycle advocates, the pedestrian advocates, the transit advocates, we had nothing going until public health came on board. So kudos to you all. We're in a crisis, an economic crisis. We're in a land use crisis. We're in a mobility crisis. We are in every form of crisis you can imagine. But one crisis that was not raised, I haven't heard raised, we're in an identity crisis. One of the things to look at is, can we move, or more than can we have to move beyond where we are passive consumers. Where we are passive consumers of our transportation system, of our built environment. Because when we're passive consumers, by the way, same type of slide, there's a pedestrian, okay? It speaks a lot. Can we move from this status quo of a geography of nowhere, a place without any meaning, frankly, communities that really have no value and are really not worth defending? This could be anywhere USA, and is this really a community of any value here? It's very, very difficult to find the value. By the way, this meets every single state and federal guideline and zoning code and transportation code, whereas this is frankly illegal in many parts of the United States. That's illegal to build. Mixed use, level of service, so on and so forth. So can we get from passive consumers to co-creators of meaningful communities, of not just functional communities, but spiritual communities, communities that have meaning, that have vision, and that are exciting? Can we get to that? So what I want to talk about is, before we even get again to the form means traffic calming speed humps, or a policy, or a complete streets. Before we get to that, there has to be, it's been mentioned twice, a common language. Now, the common language means that we have to dispel a lot of assumptions and myths. The first myth is that when you design for pedestrians, when you design for the vulnerable people, the person walking at 4 feet per second, that's just slowly, and if you're a senior, it goes down to 2.3 feet per second on average. If you design for that, then what you're doing it's a nice idea. Everybody loves it, mom and apple pie, but it has to be you have to compromise then the automobile trip. Mobility by car. That's bunk. It's absolute bunk. It's been proven time and time again, and advocates need to understand this, that in fact, when you design for that extremely vulnerable user of the roadway system, the most vulnerable person, a person in a wheelchair, a 3-foot-high child, when you design for that person, first and foremost, exclusively, everything else comes out beautifully. How many people know this idea that the slower you go, the more response time, the safer the environment? We know the magic number is at about 30 miles per hour. Then fatality rate is about 50%, 30 miles per hour. Take it up to 40, fatality rate, 85%. Take it down to 20, fatality rate, 5%. Chances are you'll be left disabled for the rest of your life if you get hit by a car as a pedestrian at 20 miles per hour, at 30 miles per hour, less so at 20 miles per hour, but you can actually survive. So we know that when you design for slow speeds, and by the way, all streets by code, by law, by guideline are designed for 20 miles per hour faster than the posted speed limit. That is a fact. So I live on a street that the posted speed limit is 30 miles per hour. The design speed is 50 miles per hour. And that is so that the occasional speeder, what's called the 85th percentile, the 15th percentile of cars that are going to speed, that person should be able to speed safely. You know, every other profession, we tell our doctors what to do. Marcus Welby doesn't work anymore. We tell our doctors what to do. We tell our teachers what to do. We tell all the professions this myth of the great man, you know, that they know everything, is gone except among street design, traffic engineers, traffic engineering. And it's bloodletting, frankly, because we know that when you design a street, and that was 1979, by the way, we know when you design a street magically at 24 miles per hour, and you design it for 24 miles per hour, that is not only the safest street, and they knew this in 1985, it's actually the most efficient street for moving cars. The slower the cars go, the more cars you can fit in a given amount of space. Less distance between the cars, less erratic movement between the cars. So you can move more cars on less space at 20 miles per hour than 30 or 40. So we already know that it's safer at 20, right? We know that it's more efficient for the car driver and for our economics, frankly, to build this amount of asphalt versus this amount of asphalt, to maintain stormwater runoff from this amount of asphalt, from this amount of asphalt. It's a win-win. So that's proof number one. Slow is good. I'm trying to set it up that if you design for that pedestrian who's walking at 2.3 feet per second, it works for everybody, and you don't need to compromise. Next is less is more. So here's the street I worked on in Toronto. It is St. George. It cuts right through the University of Toronto campus. It's a 4-lane road. It carried 30,000 cars a day. I'm sure you have anybody here in ADT and all that stuff. I'm sure there's a street in Indianapolis that carries 30,000 cars. Big, ugly, dysfunctional street. Huge pedestrian traffic. So here's what we did. We didn't do a road diet, you know, where you have a center right turn lane. By the way, a road diet doesn't happen. You cannot do a road diet for anything above 20,000 cars a day. This is 30,000 cars a day. We took it from a 4-lane to a 2-lane, okay? Then the intersections. We narrowed the intersections. This was a major, major project, okay? About a $5 million project, which Canadians, that's about $2 American. No, it's actually equal now. And what we did is we slowed down the cars by design to 15 17, 18 miles an hour. So you're thinking, this is crazy. People are going to go crazy because they have to drive so slowly. What we found is that we maintained 30,000 cars a day on half the amount of road space because the cars went slower. And the drivers were happier when we did surveys because instead of speeding up and stopping, they moved gradually and continually through the corridor in a civilized manner. And this is what we did with the reclaimed space. First of all, we put in a bike lane, which was absolutely unnecessary. Because if the cars are going 15 miles an hour, you can share the road. Even scaredy cats like me, I don't own a bike because I'm too afraid to bike. I know, too many crashes. But I take that road when I'm in Toronto. And here's what we did with the rest of the space. Landscaping, sidewalk treatment. So this is a street that carries 30,000. Is there a street in Indianapolis, anybody know here, that carries 30,000 cars? Oh, one of these horrible one-way streets that you have going downtown. Killing your downtown, by the way. I can say that honestly. You can have all the beautiful brick crosswalks you want, but you have one-way streets cutting through your downtown. You've killed the pedestrian scale, and you've killed local economic development. And the developer, Papa George, huge, massive developer nationally, he said, this is wonderful. You're going to narrow the street. That means I get this much extra space to play with. So instead of my property line being over here, now I move my property line 10 feet into the street. So his development parcel expanded, and his financial return, his return on investment, skyrocketed. So there's a lot of benefits to less asphalt. Now, when I talk about infrastructure, this is what we're doing in Chicago. Because even though Chicago has a lot of hype and a lot of good programming and a lot of good policy, push comes to shove, 30 to 50% of the land area is impermeable. Okay? And it's designed to move and store private automobiles. That's in Chicago. LA, somebody once said 70%. It's not true, but it's very close. This is our deep tunnel to deal with stormwater runoff. And the number one reason why we close our beaches in Chicago is stormwater runoff. Less asphalt, less runoff. Less beach closures, my kids are happier. And that's what it's all about. The next thing is that good design's a matter of funding. That we just need more money for sidewalks. We need more money for transit. We need more money for bicycle infrastructure. If we just had more money for safe routes to schools, everything would be hunky-dory. So there's a rule that I had when I worked for the mayor's office in Chicago. It was called the rule of lopping off a zero. Now, it's a huge risk. It's counterintuitive. If I was working on a project and it was very typical, we spent $20 million a year on streetscapes, commercial streetscapes. So an average streetscape, commercial streetscape, was about $4 or $5 million, which, it's a lot of money. If I took off a zero and made it $500,000, $400,000, all of a sudden, I was forced to design without the fluff, remember landscape architecture school, that I put in expensive berms or expensive renderings and colors. I was forced to have a fundamental black and white drawing design that worked well. I'll tell you this case. This is in Brooklyn. So it's a regular, could be anywhere, street. There was no money. Now what Giuliani understood when he was mayor was that he didn't have the money and he needed to have an impact to look good for re-election. He understood that. So here's what they did. Same lane configuration, just paint. A lot of paint. And a heck of a lot of paint. And strategically placed to start getting people, when they're out on the street, to experience something different than that. That's step number one. He got reelected for a multitude of reasons. Didn't cost a lot of money. People saw a project on the ground happening. Did it slow down the cars? We do know that the drivers, and I've done it with chalk, literally, where I drew chalk on a corner, and I'll show you another picture. And I took the big sidewalk chalk that my kids use, and I drew out lines and narrowed the street with chalk, and the drivers actually slow down. It actually works. So this cost nothing to put in. Here's another project I worked on. This is Elmdale in Chicago. Beautiful street. So the community said we wanted more parking because it had rush hour parking restrictions because it had a traffic light was installed at the other end of the street. And so all of a sudden it went from a residential street to a collector street. In engineering lingo, that means it's a more important street. So during rush hour, it was a cut-through street. So the city went in, and the plan was to cut down every one of these trees. And it was a policy that the city did. You remember we had the Asian longhorn beetle in Chicago, and it wiped out the entire blocks of trees. This policy of putting in diagonal parking in Chicago actually killed more trees than the Asian longhorn beetle. And here's what they wanted to do. They wanted to cut down the trees and put in diagonal parking in the Parkway area. This is called the Parkway. It was going to cost about $2 million to do the project. So for $20,000, we kept the curb and gutter where it was, because the expense in moving curb and gutter are catch basins and fire hydrants, and that's where the real cost is. So everything remained exactly where it was, and did something that was unconscionable. We narrowed the street. So the street, this cut-through street, couldn't change it because the traffic light was there, and it was federally funded, and it was $500,000, and we couldn't afford to buy it back by getting rid of it. What we did is we put in diagonal parking with strategically placed bump outs, and we narrowed the through street, the through lane. Trees remained, and it cost $20,000 to build. So again, we had millions of dollars to play with, lopped off, not literally lopped off to zero, but reduced the amount of money we had to play with, was forced to do something that was completely innovative. It still carries the same volume of cars, 5,000 a day. The speeds went down. Parking increased because now you don't have to worry about, I'll explain that. You don't have to, because it's diagonal parking, you don't have to worry about losing one side of the street of parking during rush hour. And so that cost nothing compared, saved the street and set a new precedent for the city. So those are the two very important rules to start this dialogue, this discourse about how to change the way we move, the way we live, and how we change the way we engage with one another in the public realm.